Welcome to the section on Zero Trust from an open group perspective. My name is Mark Simos, a lead cybersecurity architect at Microsoft. I'm also currently co-chair of the Zero Trust Architecture Working Group with the Open Group. Cyril?
Yeah, hello, I'm Cyril Voisin. I'm a Chief Security Advisor in the Europe, Middle East, and Africa time zone.
And one of the things that I took on some work to coordinate and be a liaise with the Open Group a couple of years ago. And this actually afforded me the opportunity to meet with some of the original members of the Jericho Forum, which was really, really kind of cool for me personally. So let's talk through how the Open Group is thinking about this, and we'll talk about some of the core principles that the Open Group is looking at it through.
Sure.
So ultimately, very similar to Microsoft's perspective, they're looking at Zero Trust through the lens of how do you secure assets where you are. Looking at the classic approach, which really was built around restricting everything to the network. The network has to be secure. Everything that needs to be secured has to be on the network, and that was the only place. It was like a safe space to try and keep everything. Is kind of that classic approach. Whereas Zero Trust is much more about securing the assets wherever they are, these business and technical assets, and then making sure that there's a central policy and control store. So very similar philosophy to Microsoft from that respect. Cyril, anything else?
I like this diagram because I think it summarizes very well the notion that we were trying to force everything through a secure network, and it was like when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And now we're trying to recognize that protection can be done at different levels, and I think it's a brilliant way, which is also consistent with what you would see in the NIST Zero Trust architecture documents.
Absolutely, and that flexibility is so key. And then, from the looking at the world at large, kind of through that open group lens, very much recognizing the same dynamics that are happening with the digital transformation, the cloud being the technical transformation to match it, and of course, security needing to do the Zero Trust transformation to match it. Seeing the normalization of remote work and, all these different communication patterns. You've got this sort of one of the things that I picked up that I thought was a really great insight and observation was how much the API network is becoming a normal part of business, where you pick something off the shelf of a retailer and it automatically notifies both the supplier and the transport company and all these others that, hey, we're going to need some new product because we're hitting our threshold. And there's no humans involved in this order process, or there might only be a basic approval. And so the internet economy is so connected, not just in the web apps that we interact with as humans, but also in this sort of API mesh. So that's one of the things that I picked up that I thought was a really good insight. And the modernization imperatives is it's got to be easy, right? You got to have automated policy enforcement. The identity management has to be adaptive to the people that might be a competitor one day, a partner, a supplier the next day. And so you've got to be able to have this really flexible, really responsive, automated way of approaching the people roles as well as the applications and those other elements. And of course, absolutely number one, super important, data-centric, asset-centric. This is the driving theme of all of the Zero Trust work at the Open Group. Is it has to be that the business asset, and what that is what is valuable, the data, the asset, the application that generates revenue, that stores value, the IP that can be used to generate value tomorrow. So that's really where that comes in.
That's a transition from network-centric to asset-centric, and as you said, sorry, I forgot the second one, data-centric. But when you mention trusted zones and all that, for me, it sounds like it could be the opposite of what you were saying with the Jericho Forum. Somehow these people, they were like, the perimeter has to end. What would we do if we had no perimeter? We know today that we can do Zero Trust while still having a perimeter, while still being invested to some extent into VPN and transitioning at your own rhythm. But what would that mean, the trusted zone here?
Yeah, and in the Jericho Forum, we kind of touched on it before. The Jericho Forum was actually a forum within the Open Group. It's been officially retired into the Security Forum, which is where the Zero Trust Architecture partners with the Architecture Group. But ultimately, the Jericho Forum was the first kind of rebels, the first formal opposition to that perimeter-centric approach. And with the commandments, which we'll talk about the mapping towards the end of this, they really set out and said, listen, we can't rely on this perimeter, because they were observing even back in the 1990s when hardly anybody was questioning this. Hey, this whole email attachment thing is kind of breaking the idea of the firewalls, right? And it wasn't just for phishing and whatnot back then. It's just that the data could leave the place, which of course spawned the rise of DLP and some other first generation ways of addressing that. But ultimately, the perimeter's been having holes poked in it for a very long time. The Jericho Forum was really the first ones that stood up and said, you know what? It's a group of CISOs, real professionals, large organizations, said this isn't working. This is making it hard for me to enable my business. And so they were really those first rebels, and like I said, I got to meet some of them. It's really influenced the way the Open Group is thinking about it, and also Microsoft as well.
Yeah. So can we say that the trusted zone is a way to say these are a group of assets which are consistent, high value, and this is where I'm going to put the limited resources I have in order to increase the value to my company in terms of protection, because I cannot do everything.
Exactly. You need to prioritize. What are the business assets to protect first, next, and later? That actually kind of leads us to the next visual, which is, okay, how do we actually take this super complex world and do protection for us? And this directly influenced our work with the Cloud Adoption Framework, the CAF Secure methodology, and how we sort of think about a simple view of security, which is you have all these users and devices that are trying to access stuff, right? And whether they're in a special secured zones for that sensitive business piece, or apps or systems, data information, you need to have consistent policy enforcement across the entire enterprise. It's got to be informed by threat intelligence. And that access control is the first thing to establish. And then second, modern security operations, you've got to be able to monitor and do detection and response so that you can, if an attacker does get access, you can kick them out very quickly and limit the damage they're able to do, limit the downtime and the business impact. And then kind of finishing that visibility sandwich is the governance, right? So you have that real-time visibility and response to it, but you also need to have that long view, right? That big picture. How are we doing? Are we covering everything? Are we sliding backwards? Are we actually moving forwards? Can we measure that to prove it so that we can identify those hotspots and those gaps? And where do we need architecture? Where do we need controls? Where do we need investment? And so that kind of finishes that visibility sandwich there. And then, of course, you got to protect the assets, because there's ways outside of the authorized pathways, through data at rest and data in transit, for attackers to go after those and kind of backdoor into a USB drive or sniffing network traffic. And so really kind of completing that picture with that asset protection. Again, very asset centric from the start, but making sure that all the ways you access it, et cetera, are there.
Yeah, and I think what I found interesting during the pandemics is that we realized that some companies relied on connectivity to their corp network in order for anything to work in terms of updates, in terms of visibility, and so on. And I think the mindset Zero Trust brings is this notion of, I want to have visibility, I want to have consistency of security wherever the person is going to work, the subject, the person, the device, and so on. And I want also to really encompass a number of signals for having some context about what's happening, and I think really sometimes I get the objection: is Zero Trust just like a buzzword, and no, it's a mindset. It's a journey probably to implement it, but it's very important that you can, if you can do security, where you are outside of your corporate network, I can tell you will be able to do it when you are inside. And today, the reality is the mobility of the user and the mobility of the data that came with the user. And it's important really to be able to secure all of that.
Yeah, I think Zero Trust makes us better at security, because we're letting go of an assumption that didn't hold up, and it's making us understand the business and what we're protecting better. It's making us put the controls closer to the assets and the resources. It's making us enable the users and keep them secure. So I love Zero Trust because it really takes us and makes us better as a security organization at both preserving and protecting value, but just at our own discipline, our own craft. So the principles from the Open Group are very, very similar in spirit to the Microsoft ones. The Microsoft ones tend to be kind of at the CIO, CISO, and then guiding a program is kind of how they're at. Whereas the open group was a little bit more explicit about, between the business and security, there's this magic relationship, right? And so we wanted to make sure we captured that so it was understood how that bridge should work. And so that's where a lot of the principles work towards, capturing that organizational value and risk. It's got to enable that modern work and which COVID forced into reality very quickly. And then alignment to the goals and alignment to the risk framework and the language and the prioritization. At the technology side, again, that very asset-centric, the data, the applications, the things that actually matter to the organization from a value perspective or mission completion for nonprofits and governments. Least privilege, of course, right there, perfectly aligned with the Microsoft one. Simple and pervasive. I really like this one. It's just got to be easy. It's got to be there, as invisible as possible. Explicit trust validation, perfectly aligned with the Microsoft one. And then we kind of put into a bucket sort of the guardrails and governance there, because sometimes governance, people love it, and sometimes people are like, governance, oh, that's boring, I don't like it. So we called it guardrails and governance because there's sort of an inspiring architectural element of getting people on the same page, right? And so we wanted to be explicit that we want to inspire people, we want to guide them, we want to show them that direction. And again, that simplicity thing, we want to reduce the risk and the complexity, because complexity creates risk, right? Because there's a chance that people are going to forget or miss something or make a mistake or make an assumption. And that alignment and automation to get everybody working in the same direction, to the same page. And of course, that full life cycle view that it can't just be a one and done. You've got to make sure that, okay, great, you have SSL in this particular connection or TLS, but did you actually protect the source and the destination? Is it doing authentication over? You've got to really have that holistic view of not only the life cycle of the technology piece, but also the asset over its lifetime. So a really great set of principles. Really, really enjoyed working on these. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think what I'm taking away from this is that it's built into the principles that security needs to be a business enabler. We in security have been for so long the people who say no. Everyone tries to work around us, not trying to let us know just when the deadline is very close, so that, okay, you need to approve that, and yeah, I will accept the risk as a business, and you didn't really have time to review the risk. No, we need to be the people who explain how we can achieve things, and definitely, as you said, if we are simple and we reduce complexity and we are understandable, that people know where the decision is going to be made, how it's going to be made, based on which criteria and so on, it makes the lives of everyone simpler. And for digital transformation, I think it's very important. We'll see the definition of each of these principles in the next slide for people if they want to really understand what is behind it. But I like for instance, for the risk alignment, the notion of having a consistent framework to measure things, so that it's not like surprising that this is a risk that we don't have the appetite for. The organization would not accept this. I took some notes when looking at the highlights, but when I look at what Microsoft does, as you said, we see two principles that we find exactly the same: least privilege and explicit trust validation. But the assumed compromise somehow is not explicitly mentioned there. So was there any discussion at the time about this concept, or is it like somehow spread across the different other principles?
Yeah, it's something we're actually revisiting these as we go into kind of trying to get more of an axioms or commandment level, like imperative kind of a view of this, which is a work in progress, so nothing officially to report. But that's one of the ones that we're sort of thinking about. It's really, in the current one, it's just sort of infused throughout it. We just assume it's there, because you wouldn't do all these things unless you actually assumed compromise. You wouldn't be, it's sort of it's in there, it's just not explicitly stated. So something that we can definitely take a look at in the next time around. But in this case, it's just simply kind of a part of the background in this case.
Yeah, and I think another way to formulate assumed compromise, which is around isolation. At some point you will have an issue. You need to be able to find it, to react quickly and contain it. Is this notion that I was taught when I started security of defense in depth. So all these terms, I think, are not disappearing with zero trust. They are here and more than ever. But I think people need to realize they're still there. But we are trying to articulate for making that more concrete in order to move forward.
Absolutely. And, we actually went through an exercise and did the mapping to the original Jericho Commandments. So you can see kind of how these relate to the original ones. And so, each of these is a little bit more detail on this. All these are downloadable in the Cyber Reference Architecture slides, including some slide notes. And effectively, they mapped pretty much, sometimes 1-to-1, sometimes, many to one, 3 or 4-to-1, but they're very much in the spirit of the original Jericho Forum. And, we had the Jericho Forum folks that are still around validate and make sure that we weren't making stuff up. But the one the only one that didn't quite make it is the Jericho Forum really was quite ambitious at the time. They're really trying to drive the protocols and the way the industry did that. And to a degree, they were successful through OpenID Connect and some of the other ones that did this. Now, some of those things didn't have as much security built in as the security professionals would have liked. But there was definitely a movement in this direction, whether it was attributable to the Jericho Forum or not. But all the rest of them pretty much map very, very closely, and sometimes to multiple.
Yeah, and I think it's brilliant that we're still recognizing this was like forward-looking at the time, like very ambitious, but very sound from a security perspective. Because if you are able to really put that in place, you can really be really strong in terms of security. And the fact that this adapted, I mean, I remember when I first heard about the Jericho Forum, I was working on network access protection, which was the network access control stack from Microsoft, and today, you wouldn't be able to do that because you required an agent that was able to authenticate with an Active Directory. I mean, the world is completely different today, but the concept, I think, were very sound and are driving us in the right direction. So I think it's great to see they are still encompassed.
Oh, yes. And I think implementing this back when the Jericho Forum was there was very, very difficult, even for an organization that wanted to and was funded and budgeted and had the top level support. The cloud has actually changed the dynamics and made it a lot easier to do these things. At the same time, it enabled people to be mobile and to work with mobile devices and all sorts of different devices everywhere in cloud services. It also gave us software-defined data centers and the ability to rapidly, assess policies and do all those kind of things in near real time because of the elasticity of the cloud. So I think in many ways, the cloud is making this a lot more realistic for a lot of folks. Cool. So with that, this has been the Open Group section and the Open Group perspective on Zero Trust. I'd like to thank you, Cyril, and also thank the Open Group for allowing us to include these slides in the cybersecurity reference architecture. And thank you for watching.